All right, so first of all, of course, thank you guys for the invitation and thank you for being here. So yeah, I'm going to talk about more basic perceptual and attentional processes and the rhythms of those processes. So if I go back to a little bit the basics, well, if you measure EEG or MEG, well, part of this activity is periodic, and that's what we call the oscillations. And over the years, authors have been trying to make a link between the spectral component of those oscillations, so the frequency, amplitude, and the phase, and various brain functions. And one example is that the phase of ongoing oscillations at various frequencies is related to visual perception. And for example, here in one of the classic studies, what we found is that when you present the stimulus at a given phase, say the peak of the oscillation, then it's going to be more likely to perceive that stimulus than at the opposite phase, let's say the trough of the oscillation. So perception would co-vary along with the oscillation, and more specifically along with the phase of this oscillation, with good and bad phases. So that happens in the alpha frequency band. Then still in the alpha frequency band, some authors have found that there is a link between the amplitude of the oscillation and sustained attention. So in this example, for example, the participant pay attention to the left or the right visual field, and you can see that there is a lateralization of the alpha amplitude. There is more alpha in the ipsilateral hemisphere and less alpha in the contralateral hemisphere. And of course, that was for alpha, but we also found relation with other frequency bands, for example, theta oscillation, both for the phase and the amplitude of those oscillations. So what I've been trying to concentrate on is to investigate the role of those cortical oscillations, in particular in visual attention. So before I go further, I want to give you a little bit of definition of the type of attention I'm talking about here, so operationalize this attention that I will be talking about during the rest of my talk. So, well, imagine you go out and it's pillow fight day. So that happens. And you are facing this crowd, right? You are seeing this. Well, from what you might think is that, well, seeing this crowd, you have a good perception of all the elements in this crowd, of every pillows and people coming at you. Okay. Well, from the perspective of the visual system, as you know, it looks more like that. If you keep fixating at the center, you never know, that guy might be coming at you. You keep fixating, the more you go away from that center, and the less precise is your perception, right? So now imagine that somebody is calling you from the other side of the park, right? And you still want to monitor that guy, so you keep fixating at the center, but somebody might be coming at you. So what you're going to do is deploy your attention in the periphery and monitor that side of the visual scene. And what happens through the phenomenon of attention is that you are enhancing this part of the visual display and having a better resolution. This deployment of attention that is voluntary is also called endogenous spatial attention. And this is to oppose to another type of attention, which is more involuntary. Let's say a pillow coming at you from the periphery here is going to grab your attention in an involuntary way. This is exogenous spatial attention. So today I'm going to try to talk a little bit about those two types of attention and the dynamics of those type of attention. So That's what I just said. And the approach is that first I will use psychophysics to manipulate attention. The first type that I've been using is visual search, and the other type is a cueing paradigm, a classic Posner paradigm. I will develop that in a minute. And then doing some neuroimaging to investigate the rhythms of those phenomena. All right, so the first thing is visual search. So I want, again, to go slow and go back to the basics. So there are some visual search that are more easy. And here's a classic example. It's color singleton. If you look for red among green, and if you measure accuracy as a function of the number of stimuli on the screen, you'll be as good regardless of the number of stimuli. This is an easy search. Then there are more difficult search, like here finding a T among Ls. And in this case, accuracy is going to decrease as a function of the number of distractor, or reaction time is going to increase as a function of distractor. So in this case, we assume that attention is involved. It's limiting our resources, and this is the way we can characterize it with those type of paradigm, with visual search. So to explain a little bit the dynamics of those search, we have some models that are quite old now, starting from the 80s with Trisman. But let me still develop a little bit that model to explain a little bit what were the hypotheses that we had in order to develop our paradigm. So here is a visual search that will have a given dynamics, and the first stage is, of course, going to the first level of the visual system, decomposing the scene in different features like color, orientation, etc. Right? Then this information converge in this model to a higher level region, which support what we can call a saliency map, or a master location map, or a priority map, whatever you want to call it. But the goal of this region is to select the position of the most salient stimulus. Now imagine that you are in an easy search, like here finding red among blue, right? By definition, the target is the most salient object. So it's going to be selected first by the saliency map, and then you're going to go back down in order to enhance the processing of that stimulus, right? So in easy search, this happens quite early, quite fast in the process. Now imagine that it is a difficult search, like here finding a T among Ls. Now there's not necessarily any difference in saliency between target and distractor. So you select one, you check, you enhance, it's not the target. Well, you have to go back up, select another one, and go back and enhance the processing of that one stimulus, and so on and so forth until you find finally the target, and tell me, okay, the target was present or not, it was absent, right? So in a difficult search, you might think, according to this model, that there are several iterative loops between high and low level areas, meaning that these low level areas are going to be involved at multiple delays during the difficult search. Well, that's what we tried to figure out, and in order to do so, what we did was to apply TMS over the occipital pole at different delays over over V1, and during two types of search. First, during an easy search, we didn't find anything, and once again, we started at a late delay. And during a difficult search, what we found was a significant effect at about 300 milliseconds after the onset of the search display, and maybe a peak a little bit earlier, but it wasn't significant. So if we go back to the model, it didn't really work out, right? We found a late delay of involvement of V1, but it wasn't iterative, right? It happened only once. So we were wondering maybe that was just a bad design. Okay, so what we did was to try to capitalize on this experiment and design a better experiment, hopefully. So we applied a pulse always at this delay. We ran the same task, and I will develop the task in a minute. We applied a pulse always at that delay, and the goal of that one pulse was to overall decrease the performance for all our trials. And then on different trials, we applied another pulse, a second pulse, but at different delays around the first one. So now the first pulse decreases overall performance. The second pulse is going to try to find a second delay. So here's the task. The first step is to do what we call phosphine mapping procedure. So the goal of this procedure is the following. You apply TMS over the occipital pole at, a little bit of intensity, quite a bit of pulses, quite a bit of a frequency. The goal is for you to see what we call a phosphine, which is an illusory flash when you stimulate the occipital pole. Now, we don't see the flash as an experimenter, right? So we ask our participant to draw this phosphine on the screen with a computer mouse, and this region, which is the phosphine region, is going to be the region where we present our visual search display in the next trial. I will explain in a second. So what that means is that we are stimulating over the occipital pole. We are presenting a stimulus in the renotopic region where we are stimulating, as characterized by the phosphine, which means that we will have an interaction with this stimuli. And the control region is not a different site over the occipital pole, but just a different presentation region, which is simply the symmetric region compared to the phosphine region. So we have a specific renotopic control of our stimulation. So then we did a difficult search. We presented same type of search array, like finding a T among L's in the phosphine region or in the control symmetric region randomly. And then we presented, as I mentioned earlier, a fixed pulse at that delay that we found in the previous experiment, and the second pulse at varying delay around the first one. And every couple blocks, we came back to the phosphine mapping in order to ensure that the coil because the participant didn't move. And we recorded as well EEG, and I will explain why in a second. Okay, so this is the method, and here are the results. I represent here the performance in hit rates as a difference between the trial in the control region minus the phosphine regions, which means that above 0 is an impairment, a decrease in performance as a function of the stimulation, and here's a facilitation. This time point here is the delay of the fixed pulse, and here are the performance according to the delay of the moving pulse. So first, what you can see is that, well, it's moving. It's not the same thing according to the delay. So we have characterized this modulation over time, and just to give you an intuition, here these two type of peaks are separated by the same period here, and they are shifted in their phase. So this is something that we can characterize as a periodic modulation. So in order to quantify this modulation, what we did was to run a Fourier transform on that. And we represent the result of the Fourier transform as amplitude as a function of frequency. We ran statistics, so let me show you first the statistics. Basically, the null hypothesis was hit rates are independent of the delay, so we ran permutation statistics, and here the color represents the level of significance of this permutation, and here the null amplitude spectrum. So here is the result of the amplitude spectrum, and what you can see is that there is a significant peak here at about 6 Hertz, which means that this curve here is significantly modulated at 6 Hertz. Okay, so that's the result of this TMS experiment. As I told you, we did as well EEG recording in the same participant, same session, but not with TMS pulses, so independent trials. So I'm going to walk you through the different hypotheses that we have for the EEG analysis. So say that after the onset of the search display, there is in the brain a processing that is periodic, right? It's like this, and presumably supported by an oscillation in the brain at that one frequency, right? So this would be my optimal search oscillation, right? The idea is to say that at a given time point, I can represent this oscillation in the complex domain. Here, the angle represents the phase of that oscillation. And if I record my EEG, well, I might find some slight departure from my optimal search oscillation, right? The hypothesis that we had is to say that if I separate the trials according to the response of my participants, say correct or incorrect at finding whether the target is here or not, well, I'm thinking that maybe the correct trials are closer to my optimal search oscillation than the incorrect trials. So to quantify this, you calculate what we call phase locking for each of your conditions, and you assume that there is going to be a higher phase locking for correct trials than incorrect trials. That was the hypothesis. So to test for this, we did phase locking difference. So here is an example for one given oscillation. Of course, we did this for all time and frequencies in our signal. So here's the result. And what you can see here is that there is a significant phase locking difference between correct and incorrect trials. It happens to be, and once again, in independent trials than the TMS trial at 5.7 hertz, which is the same frequency we found with TMS. So that's what I said. We ran this experiment in a completely different study, which is finding a plus among L, which is an easy version of the same task. So the accuracy as a function of set size is flat. Attention is presumably not involved, and this phase locking difference is absent. Now, that was for after the search array onset. Now, what happens before the search array onset? Well, here the signal is spontaneous. It's an ongoing signal. It hasn't been reset by anything that happens on the screen. So our hypothesis is slightly different. In this case, we think that, well, if we separate the trials, once again, between correct and incorrect responses, in this case, maybe correct trials will have a given phase, right? Maybe it will be aligned with the next coming stimulus, easier to reset, right? But what that means is that by definition, if once again, this is a spontaneous signal, which means that across all my trials, for both correct and incorrect trials, at one given time point, the phase is random, so homogeneously distributed on your trigonometric circle. It means that if half of the trials is pointing in one direction, the other half of the trial has to point in the opposite direction. Okay, so in this case, what we looked at is not phase locking difference anymore, but phase opposition between correct and incorrect trials. Once again, this is schematic representation. We did this for all time and frequencies before zero in our signal, and this is what we found. We found a significant phase opposition that happened to be in the central parietal region at about 6 hertz, so about the same frequency as before. And once again, when we do this in a easy version of the task, it happens to be not there anymore. All right, so if I summarize this part, as I showed you, there is occipital theta oscillation that co-varies with attentional exploration during a difficult version of the search. Now, if you think about it, and if we go back to my definition of attention, which is endogenous attention, exogenous attention, etc. Well, visual search is not very much appropriate to investigate exactly the type of attention that you might be looking for. Visual search might be involving exogenous, endogenous, you don't really know, maybe even a little bit feature-based attention and so on. So in the next experiment, I wanted to look at those rhythms basically, but for a specific type of attention. And here I'm going to show you one that is endogenous spatial attention. So in this case, what we did was same thing as before. We did the phosphine mapping procedure, once again, to localize the stimulated region of phosphine region and the control region, the non-renotopic region, which is our control. And here what we did was to use this cueing procedure that I was mentioning in the introduction. So what that means is that we use a central cue here, which is this black bar, to instruct our participant to either pay attention to the bottom right or to the bottom left quadrant. Okay? Then after a given delay, two GABA patches appeared, one in the stimulated region and one in the control region. Now, the central cue, the second one, is a reference cue and tell you which one is the target. In this case, the right one is the target. In this case here, this is a valid trial because you paid attention to the location of the target, and here an invalid trial because you have to reorient to the unattended location, to the previously unattended location, in order to discriminate the target. The task for the participant is a 2AFC task, meaning that they have to discriminate between clockwise and counterclockwise relative to the vertical. All right, so here we applied, once again, TMS at different delays after the offset of the stimulus display. And again, because of this procedure, we either stimulated the target or we stimulated the distractor, right? So there was valid and invalid trial when we stimulate either the target or the distractor. So here are the results. I represent D prime as a function of the TMS delay. And first of all, let's look at blue versus red. So valid versus invalid. Overall performance are higher in the valid than the invalid condition. Well, that's good. That's a sanity check. It means that we accurately manipulated attention. When you pay attention to the target location, you are better at discriminating that target. Okay. Now, if we concentrate on the invalid trials, meaning that you are needing to reorient your attention from one location to another in order to discriminate the target, right? What happens here is, first of all, there is a difference between dark red, which is stimulated the target, and pink, which is stimulating the distractor. It happens that either of those two curves are modulated with the same type of analysis that I showed you before, FFT on those curves and so on. They are modulated at 5 Hertz, and not only they are modulated at 5 Hertz, but we also quantify that they are shifted in their phase. What that means here is that at this time point, if your attention is on the target location, then attention shifts to the distractor, and so on and so forth over time. So when you instructed your participant to reorient once, then attention shifts between one location to another at 5 Hertz, so once again in the theta frequency range. And once again, that involves early visual area. In this case, we were again stimulated the V1, V2 complex. So again, in this experiment in which we explicitly manipulated endogenous spatial attention and its reorienting, so we manipulated explicitly exploration of the space by attention, we found that this phenomenon occurs at the theta frequency. All right, so I want to go back to visual search and show you a second way we can investigate those rhythms. So far I have been talking about EEG. I've been talking about several ways you can look at rhythm in EEG, post-stimulus, pre-stimulus. I've been talking about TMS and the way you can use TMS in order to characterize those rhythms and the way the different regions are involved. Here I'm going to talk about psychophysics only, and how you can investigate those rhythms using some probability statistics. So here, once again, in a difficult search, what happens is that if you increase the set size, your accuracy decreases, right? Or your reaction time increases. To explain this effect, there are two models, right, that have been proposed for many years now, and we still don't know which one is the good one, if there is a good one, right? So let me introduce those models and explain why we still don't know. So one model says that, let's say you have two stimuli, right? You're going to deploy your attention in a uniform way on both of those stimuli, or in other words, in parallel, right? Which means that you have the same amount of attention on this one than on this one. Now, if you have 5 stimuli, 10 stimuli, and if you deploy in a uniform way your attention on those stimuli, meaning you deploy the same amount of attention on either of those, you will explain this. You have less attention on either stimulus, your accuracy is going to decrease, or you are going to need more time in order to process the task. That explains this result. So that's one model. The second model is a non-uniform model, and the far end of the spectrum is the extreme, which means that you explore one stimulus at a time in a serial or sequential fashion, which is also going to explain this effect, meaning the more stimuli and the more time you're going to need in order to perform that search, right? And of course, in the middle, you have kind of, well, the middle scenario where it's always on kind of both of them, but more or less, right? So that's the 3 different models. Now, in the uniform model, imagine that at one trial or at one given time point, attention is uniformly on both of them, meaning there's the same amount of attention on stimulus 1 and stimulus 2. At the next trial or at the next time point, well, it's going to be the same, right? So if you measure performance, well, at the end of your experiment, what's going to happen is that, well, your average performance are going to be the same for stimulus 1 and stimulus 2, right? Now, in a non-uniform model, let's say at the first trial or at the first time point, once again, you have more attention on one than the other one. Well, at the next trial or at the next time point, it's going to be inverted, right? Which means that once again, over trials, over time point, what's going to happen is that you're going to have overall the same performance for stimulus 1 and stimulus 2. So at the end of your experiment, well, you're going to have performance coming from a binary answer, yes or no, I was able to do the task, or to detect the presence of my target among distractor, but that doesn't tell you whether it was a sequential exploration or non-uniform or some uniform exploration. You don't know that, right? So the solution that we have developed is to say, well, we have to measure performance for both of those stimuli here that I presented in my example. So we present 2 stimuli. We asked the identity of both of those stimuli, and what we measure at the end of the experiment is the probability to report both of those stimuli correctly, or only one correctly, or none of them correctly. That's what we have at the end of our experiment. Now, using some second-degree equation, we can reconstruct those probability as follows. And what we have by solving a second-degree equation is 2 solutions, which are solution 1 and solution 2. And as you know, solution of a second-degree equation can either be equal or they can be different. And in this case, we're going to be calling P1 the one at the most attended location, and P2 the least attended location. And once again, we have the assumption that if you are better at one location, it means that there is more attention. We do that simplification, okay? So that's what we did. We were looking for this, and that's the task that we had. We were doing a classic, once again, finding a T among L's. And after varying delays, what we did was to present two stimuli, two probes that were letters in this one experiment at two of the four previous search locations randomly. And at the end, the main task for the participant was the search. You have to do the task, which is finding a T among L and tell me whether it's present or absent. And the role of that task was to engage someone's attention. And now the question is it uniform or non-uniform, right? And the way we ask that is by probing attention at different moments during the search by asking them to report the identity of those two probes and solving the second degree equation that I mentioned earlier on those two probes. Here is the result. This is the probe report probability for so P1 and P2 as a function of the different times that we tried. So first of all, P1 over time is different than P2, which means that in this search, it's non-uniform. There is a difference between the two probed locations. Now, we did our classic analysis that you know now by the end of the talk. We did, first of all, the difference between P1 and P2, which means the higher it goes and the more focused attention is, the more non-uniform attention is. And we did a Fourier transform analysis on this graph and represent amplitude as a function of frequencies with, of course, the resolution that we had based on the different delays that we tried. And the color represents the level of significance. And as you can see, there are two things. One, there is a peak at a low frequency here, which represents this trend here of performance going down over time. And I can develop that if you want. But what you can see also is that there is a faster frequency at about 7 hertz, as well as the harmonic, which means that this is modulated over time at that one frequency, 7 hertz. So not only in this task, attention is non-uniform, but attention is non-uniform in a periodic way. So we did this for this task, and then we replicated quite a bit of time now using the same procedure and different tasks. We did this in a conjunction search looking for spatial frequency and orientation gratings and found theta as well, slightly lower in this case. And more recently, we did this in the case of a queuing procedure in which we ask explicitly the participant to reorient their attention. So in this case, we manipulate the exploration, and we found as well a peak at about 6 hertz in this case. All right, so what I was saying in the introduction is that I'm interested in the dynamics of attentional exploration, and I want to oppose this to sustain attention at a given location. And to do this, I use psychophysics in order to manipulate it first, and then some exploration of those rhythms, and especially using EEG and TMS experiments in the two cases that I showed you. Now, this is a little bit the idea that we have in order to explain a little bit what happens. Here I explained earlier that you can increase the processing of a location. Well, presumably when there is exploration, this phenomenon happens in a periodic fashion in the theta frequency range. Thank you, and thank you to all my collaborators as well as the funding.
Thank you, Laura. We have time for a couple of questions.
In this literature on the rhythm of attention, we see effects and frequencies from 4 to 8, not from 2 to 10, which is like a dramatic difference. Do you have an interpretation of this variability?
Yeah, so actually recently we proposed an interpretation based on a meta-analysis of all those results. And here it is. So a first piece of answer is one, this meta-analysis showed that there are two trends. One is all the experiments that are around theta, so more 4, 5, 6, and all the experiments that are more about alpha, so around the frequency you were mentioning, 10, 12. So there is really a trend. Now, if you look further, what you realize is that the ones that are lower frequency, first of all, and then I will go in the details of those lower frequencies, but the difference between theta and alpha is that it's not just that there is attention, it's that there is exploration. And all those low frequency, you look at those experiments and you see that they manipulate attention location over time. Attention is switching, and it happens to be at those low frequencies. When attention is sustained at a given location, then alpha is going to be involved, and it's the phenomenon of like lateralization of alpha, for example. Now, within each of those bands, we're always talking about bands, and why is it not always a single one? Well, two things. One is the resolution of our methods, using TMS, using probes, delays. If you want enough resolution, you have to find that trade-off, right? Like enough delays, but enough trials. So we never are above about 20 hertz in those behavioral experiments, NTMS experiments. Now that's one thing. But second, well, the other thing that might be involved in what rhythm is involved is a little bit like accumulation evidence. Maybe because of the task difficulty, the load of attention, the rhythms that is going to be involved is going to change. Its frequency is going to change. We do believe in this theory of discrete perception, meaning that you accumulate evidence in snapshot, right? And we have quite a bit of evidence for that now. But the idea is to say, if you are having a harder task, then you may need either a slower rhythms, which is going to modulate your frequency, or, and that's the alternative hypothesis, more cycles to accumulate, which is not changing the frequency, but changing the amount of cycles. So that one of those reasons might be the different in the type of task. And if you look at this, well, here this task is much more difficult than this one, and it's a slower frequency. So maybe there is also a bit of that.
It's a related question, so I'm struck by the pace of attention modulation. So silence is very quick. At least subjectively, it doesn't seem that our attention switches that fast.
Definitely.
So my question is based on two questions. So first, what do you think is the subjective correlate of that rhythm? And secondly, so I'm not an expert, of course, but I think I know that phenomena such as inhibition of return is much slower, and that should induce a something like an oscillation at the pace of 1 hertz, or maybe less than 1 hertz.
Mhm.
So how do you, are these consistent with each other?
Yeah. Yeah, so, all right, so if I go back. So one is it's very fast. Yes, it's super fast, and to have an intuition of this is not easy, and I think it's mainly because the type of attention that we are used to is not the type of attention that I'm talking about. Exogenous and endogenous attention are things that happens at the level of the millisecond. For example, exogenous attention, which is the inhibition of return that you just mentioned, which is the one that attracts your attention in the periphery, happens in the order of 100 milliseconds. It's very quick. It's very quick. Now, inhibition of return is something that happens further down, so more 300, 400, 500 milliseconds. So the reason of this inhibition of return phenomenon is that it goes up, attention goes up at first, about 100 milliseconds, and later you see it going down. The way we have characterized this is by checking different cueing delays, basically. You present a cue, and then you present a stimulus. For the peak of exogenous attention to happen, it should be a delay of 100 milliseconds. Now, if you present a cue and you present a stimulus at 600 milliseconds later, then you have, instead of having a facilitation by the cue, you have an inhibition. So it's hard to reconcile this, but one of the reasons that it could happen, and it's very speculative, we still don't know, is that maybe this is one of the optimal phase, if you want. So you reset it with the cue, and then there are cycles, and then you need, once again, if we believe in this accumulation of evidence idea, you need a given number of cycles that will depend on the task, right? So maybe this 500 millisecond or whatever the inhibition of return is the optimal number of cycles that you are being able to see. Super speculative, and I'm sure it doesn't answer completely your question, but the short answer is that we don't know exactly. Now, the type of attention that I think you were mentioning when you say subjective experience of attention is more the long-term type of attention that we can think of, and I would call that maybe more concentration, awareness, etc. And it's not, again, the time scale of the type of attention that we are talking about here. And finally, there are very cool experiments to show you your own rhythms, to show you how you can experience your alpha or your theta rhythms with illusions. And one is the wagon wheel illusion, when you have like you drive on the highway and you look at the wheel of the car. Sometimes instead of going that way, they go that way. And our kind of explanation now that has been, having more and more support based on the experiments is that, well, imagine that you take one snapshot when the wheel is here, and then another snapshot when another snapshot when it turns 3/4 of turn, then the more likely interpretation is that it had turned the other way around. And that's a cool one, and you can experience it yourself. Yep.
Thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you.
Can you go back to the PNAS paper where you explained the paradigm? And I'm interested in the relation between the search task and the probe task. So this basically looks like you have two things to do.
Mm-hmm.
And you presented some very interesting data about the probes.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't tell us anything about the search.
Yeah.
And the reason why this might be important is perhaps some of the fluctuations in spatial attention that you're associating with the probe task
Mhm.
could be fluctuations in sort of executive management and cognitive resources
Mhm.
related to the search task.
Yes. So as you can imagine, we had that question many times. This PNAS paper was slightly unsatisfying in answering those questions, which is why I replicated with that conjunction search that I was mentioning, which is cleaner. And we have tried many things. So one is, of course, looking at the search results. And one thing that is critical is that here, if the delay between this and this is short, what's going to happen is obviously masking, first of all. In the new paper, to address that concern, we use delay slightly longer for the first delay and avoid masking, and it's still not changing our result. The second thing is that we did look at the search performance according to the delay of this and didn't find any difference depending on the delay, except in the PNAS paper for the first two delays there was a little bit of masking. Otherwise it was plateauing at about 75% correct, which is what we had set up. And the goal, once again, it's hard, but the goal is that this search is absolutely critical, and we also make sure that our participants know that that's their goal in life. They have to do the search. They have to do it correctly. They have to be involved in that, because obviously we need them to be engaging whatever attention they have to engage. And in the end, with all the replication, that made me very much satisfied in our paradigm. And we have been testing many things, and the critical last test that we did was to try without the search and replicate all of our experiment on the probes without the search, and asking them to deploy equally their attention on two probes. And we had P1 equal to P2, meaning they were able to deploy uniformly their attention on the two. So really the search is able to impact our result on the probes.